July 6th, 2026. With the containers in place and squared up to each other, I could start thinking about putting a roof on the new boat shed. Before I can do that though, I need a way to attach the wooden framing to the steel containers. They do make brackets that attach to the containers, but they're expensive, and I have an idea for a way to do it myself without drilling holes that might allow water through. Plus, I get to learn a new skill in the process. I'm going to attach 2x4 rails, or bottom plates, not really sure what to call them, along the top edges of each container using nuts and bolts. I was trying to be a bit too precise and used my miter saw to cut most of the rough 2x4s to exactly 10 feet, but then I remembered I had a tool that would help me speed things up. I lined up the ends of the 2x4s, clamped them together, and screwed on a small guide to make sure that the cut was square. It's a short chainsaw attachment for my circular saw that gives it a 12-inch cutting depth, without having to spend $1,000 or more on an actual beam saw. It doesn't take too long to install, and I like that I get to broaden the use of a tool that I already own. It's surprisingly accurate as long as you put the guide in the right spot. Once they were all cut, I took 4 of the 2x4s and cut half laps into them so that the ends would sit up on the corners of the containers, which are about 1 inch higher than the edges. Then I used my grinder with a flap disc to clean up some of the rust and welded repairs that the container had accumulated throughout its life crossing the oceans. Luckily, these newer containers don't have lead in the paint, but I still wanted to minimize the amount of paint dust that I was spreading into the meadow by sucking it up with my shop vac. I'm doing my best not to light it on fire by sucking up the sparks in the process. Once I had the worst of the rust cleaned up, I painted the bare metal with all-back linseed paint. It's their project paint, which is just a random mix of colors that are left over from the manufacturing process. It's half the price of their regular colors, and it's just as great as a base coat or for stuff like this that won't really be visible. July 8th. With the rust cleaned up and the paint dry, I had to lay out where the framing and attachment bolts were going to go. I'm going to frame 24 inches on center, so I used my 100-foot tape and a grease pencil to mark my layout, striking a line and then an X on the side where the framing will sit. Then I marked the locations of the bolts. With the first rail laid out, I used it to transfer the lines onto the next with my speed square so that they were exactly the same, just mirrored. Then I moved it over to the other container to do the same for the other two top rails before cutting the half laps for the 4 corner boards. I got to try out the Japanese Shinto rasp that the folks at Wooden Boat sent me to make a chamfer so that the boards won't contact the welds at the corner blocks on the shipping containers. This is my first rasp, and I feel like it's going to come in handy pretty frequently on the boat. With the rails/plates all laid out, I started to drill the pilot holes for the bolts, being sure to go through the lumber and drill a small indent into the metal that I could reference later. After that, I used a Forstner bit to drill an oversized hole for the bolts, and then broke out my new small welder. I thought this would be the perfect time to stress test the newest power station that BLUETTI sent me to try, their Elite 400, and hopefully not torture it too much in the process. It has a telescopic luggage handle and wheels which make it easy to move around horizontally, but unfortunately for me, since I don't have an extension cord capable of powering a welder, I had to lift it vertically, almost 10 feet into the air on top of one of the containers, which was awkward. Once I had successfully lifted it, I thoroughly read the welder's manual, set up the welder, and got to learning.
Gross. Okay.
Of course, I immediately tripped the breaker since I had the amperage way too high, but eventually I found the right settings to make everything work. Or so I thought. I won't use this to weld long term. I'm already asking way too much of this power station, but I'm really impressed with how it's handling this stress testing. After all of the bolts are installed, it'll become my secondary power unit for the boat shed. July 9th. I started the morning by organizing the bolts, nuts, and washers I would need for the first container, and then went back on top to keep welding. Once I had the bolts for the first 2x4 welded on, I test fitted it to make sure that it was going to work, and then drilled the holes, ground off the paint, and welded on the rest of the bolts along the left edge. But then, on the second to last bolt, I thought, I should probably test how strong these welds are. Obviously that thought should have entered my brain sooner, because it turns out they weren't strong at all.
Damn.
And so I had to knock off and redo the 11 bolts that I had just welded. The problem turned out to be that I was using wire that was too thick, and that my welding settings were still wrong. Like I said, I was asking a lot of this power station. I went into town to get some thinner flux core wire, adjusted the settings, and then tried again. It worked way better. I was getting better penetration into the container's sheet metal, and hitting it with a mallet only bent the bolt/sheet metal slightly.
That ain't going nowhere.
With everything dialed in, I put my head down and quickly re-welded the bolts that had failed, finishing the left side of the container. Although those first welds didn't stick to the container, they did stick to the bolts. Not wanting to waste perfectly good bolts, I set up my bench grinder and ground them clean so that I could weld them onto the right side. July 12th. I spent the morning finishing up welding the bolts onto the right edge of the container. When I was younger, yesterday's setback would have made me a lot more upset. I used to be really hard on myself when I made mistakes, and still am to an extent, but I've been working hard on recognizing that all of this is just part of the learning process. All you can really do is grind your welds clean, recognize what didn't work, and try again. And remember the lessons you learned in the process, from yourself or a mentor, or even YouTube. Once I had all the bolts installed, I test fitted the rails and then broke out the generator to charge the power station. I'm still waiting on some cables before I can start using solar power to charge things, but for now, this is a good stopgap. Plus, it'll be great in the winter when the sun disappears for like 5 months behind the clouds. Then I got to work drilling, grinding, and welding the other container. I was so close to finishing, but ran out of wire with 4 bolts left to weld. Looks like I'm making another trip to the hardware store tomorrow morning. July 13th. After I bought the wire, I set up the welder and immediately jammed it. Once I cleared the line, I finished welding the last of the bolts. I don't think I'm qualified to say this, but honestly, I don't think these welds look too bad, especially the last ones I did. Anyway, I'd like to keep honing this as a skill. I think it'll be really useful in the future. The little welder did pretty good, other than the 6 times it jammed and mangled the wire. And I'm extremely happy with how the Elite 400 did. It's going to make an excellent addition to the off-grid power system. July 14th. My solar panel cables and adapters finally arrived, so I thought I would set up the solar panels I've had for a while. I got them from a friend for free because the glass faces are shattered. I figured they'd still produce some power, so I quickly threw together a stand and got them wired up. Well, it turns out that they are putting out way less power than I thought they would. They're rated for 500 watts each, but even later in the day when it got sunny, between the two of them plus an unbroken 100 watt panel, I was getting a maximum of 180 watts. It was worth a shot, but I should really just buy some decent unbroken panels. Before I could install the rails, I needed to paint the exposed metal, so I got out the blowtorch and used it to burn off the moisture from the rain we had overnight before painting all of the bolts with linseed paint. Then, to protect the wood, I mixed up a batch of boat soup, or linseed oil and pine tar, a traditional wood preservative.
Ugh.
Normally, it also has turpentine in it to thin it out, but I just heated it up in a double boiler instead. Foolishly, I forgot to loosen the lid of the jar before I heated it up, so the pressure blew the side of the jar out. I saved what I could and then started applying it to the bottom of the rails. Once that was done, I drew up a sort of code chart inside one of the containers. These codes will be written on each component so that the container shelter can easily be reassembled if I move or sell it in the future. Once I had written the codes on the container and each corresponding 2x4, I threaded the washers and nuts onto the bolts and looked for something to tighten them down. With that done, I painted the boat soup onto the exposed fasteners to protect them from rusting, and then I was done. The containers are now officially ready for framing. Now comes the fun part, building the roof.